Hi, my name is Connie Buckman. I'm the district's Chief Academic Officer. Today I'd like to share a little information about what in-person teachers can expect during a short-term or long-term closure at the elementary level. We'll talk through community building in your classroom, schedules and instructional minutes, and then instructional expectations, assessments, grading, communication, and professional learning communities. Before we get started, I just want to take a quick minute to acknowledge the hard work of our instruction task force members. From each level, we gathered groups of classroom teachers, special area teachers, and special education teachers. We also had administrators, FESPA, and FHEA representation, in addition to a few district office supports. This group spent multiple days over the summer developing and revising plans. They met with focus groups of teachers to vet their ideas. They brought the feedback back to the task force and made additional adjustments before finalizing the documents. Please take a minute to thank your colleagues for all of their effort, their continual problem solving, and their dedication to the process. Staff can access the plans of the task force at bit.do/closureplan. Please remember that these plans are specific to our in-person teachers who are experiencing a short-term closure at their building or potentially a long-term closure that might be district-wide. A separate document was created by the task force to provide guidance to our virtual teachers. This resource was shared during the virtual teacher boot camp prior to the start of the school year. Anyone can access the document, which is found at bit.do/virtualteacher. As we start to consider what the 2021 school year might look like, we want to begin with the social-emotional needs of your students. We know that when our kids come back on August 31st, they're likely going to need more support than they have in years past. Over the summer, the Mental Health Task Force worked to create some community building and mental wellness resources for all of our teachers to use in their classrooms. This resource is linked in the expectation document that you can find at bit.do/closureplan. When you visit that folder, you'll see that resources are broken into level-specific folders. And once in the folder for elementary, you'll find various topics. Inside those topics, you'll find folders that have sample slide decks, documents, linked resources, and more. These folders are intended to serve as a year-long resource. The primary focus should be building relationships with students in your class. This supportive community will increase the learning and the classroom and the supports and social-emotional needs of kids and teachers. This year, more than in years past, teachers will spend time developing community on a regular basis. Part of the logic in identifying the superhero standards was to allow extra time for you to spend creating community in your classroom. Your school counselors and your educational support counselors, or ESCs, they're a wonderful resource as you look for additional ideas or you need additional supports in this area. Should we have to close school for a short time, maybe a week or two, students will continue to follow the same schedule as if they were in person. If the district were to move into a longer-term district-wide closure, elementary students and staff will still continue to follow the same schedule as if they were in person. As we prepare for the potential of those short and/or long-term closures, the task force spent a lot of time considering how we would allow students and staff time to transition from being in person to at-home learning. During the first 1 or 2 days of a closure, teachers have two options. If what you already had planned for the day can easily be flipped to virtual delivery, you're welcome to proceed as planned. If, on the other hand, what you had planned won't work for your virtual day, then you should pull from a bank of teacher-created lesson plans. To be prepared for this situation, we're asking that teachers have a small bank of emergency lesson plans on hand. These should be enrichment-type lessons that focus on the superhero standards. They could be used by a sub, or you could use them should we move into a closure. Since there's the potential for buildings to be in the process of issuing student devices during the initial days of a closure, it will be important that teachers assume some of their students might not have access to a device during the first few days of a closure. Kids who are in this situation shouldn't be penalized, which is why there's specific guidance to avoid collecting work and/or issuing grades during this time of transition. There's also mention of lowering the rigor and the expectations during the initial 2 days. And that's because we want to be sure that students have opportunities for success as they transition to this new routine and new instructional delivery model. It's also safe to assume that if we're moving into a closure, there's a considerable amount of stress in the school community. These 2 days of transition will provide some time for everyone to transition. The first 2 days of the closure should also include a significant amount of community building and mental health check-ins. It's important that kids feel a sense of community as their normal routines are disrupted due to the closure. Please refer to the previously mentioned folder, which is linked in bit.do/closure plan for all of those mental health resources. Once you hit the 3rd day of a closure, your instruction should start progressing as normal. This means that kids should have assignments and be progressing through the curriculum with new learning. It should start to feel like a typical school day, just delivered virtually. If there are some students who are still waiting for district-issued technology, teachers should work with them individually and provide exceptions and grace based on their individual situation. Once we get past the 3rd day of the closure, teachers should resume their normal routines and instructional schedules. Virtual daily instruction will continue to mirror that of in-person daily instruction. This means that teachers will continue to provide mini lessons, conference with kids, hold community meetings, etc. It also means that students should continue to experience a mix of direct instruction, small group instruction, independent practice, peer collaboration in a Zoom breakout room, specials, breaks, etc. We know how we as adults feel after a couple hours of Zoom meetings, and we also know that these kids are going to be in front of screens for multiple hours during the school day. And so to honor this, we're asking that all work, including independent practice, be completed during the school day, and no homework be issued to students during a closure. One exception might be if a teacher wishes to assign some reading, independent reading in the evenings as appropriate. Just keep in mind that any length of closure is likely to add additional stress to families, and even some nightly reading that's typical could create extra stress during a closure. And so we just want to be sure we're offering grace to our students and our families during this time. In an effort to provide a generic idea of how a school day might look, we've created a fictional 2nd grade schedule today. So as you can see, this classroom is starting with a morning meeting to help build community in their virtual classroom. In this fictional schedule, they then move into a reader's workshop where the teacher will deliver a mini lesson through Zoom. On this particular day, kids will then be placed in Zoom breakout rooms, and they'll read independently until the teacher gets to their group for some small group reading instruction. At the end of reading, everyone would log off and take a break, and then they'll hop back on for writer's workshop, which will mirror much of what they saw during reading. On this particular day, they might be working independently, and then the teacher would hop among virtual breakout rooms to conference one-on-one with individual students. Kids would then log off and have a break for lunch and recess. After lunch, they would jump back in with some math instruction. The teacher would deliver instruction, which might include some videos, some screen sharing, some modeling. She might be using a document camera. Kids would then begin to work in small groups, individually or with a partner, depending on what it is the teacher has planned for that day. Kids would then log into a Zoom with their special area teacher for art or music or PE. And then after specials, they'll hop back in a Zoom with their classroom teacher for their read aloud, followed by word block, word study, or language block. And this block would include small chunks of instruction around phonics, handwriting, shared writing, interactive writing, and those components, will vary a little bit by grade level. Kids would then wrap up their day engaged in some content learning, which would include science or social studies or maybe even some health. So as you can see by the sample schedule, students will need to log on and offline multiple times during the day. And while teachers will be interacting with them for the majority of the day, we also know that there will be times that they might have to work without the direct support of a teacher. And so students will need an adult who can encourage them to stay focused and persevere when things get tricky. Many students will need help managing their time and staying organized. It's important for us to notice that unlike kids who opted into virtual education, kids who are learning virtually during a closure did not choose that option. And many families may not be able to provide the desired level of support to their students during a closure. And so we'll ask schools to work through those situations with individual families as they come up. School counselors, ESCs, administrative teams, they'll all be key resources in helping families through the situation. During a closure, kids at all levels will continue to engage in their resource classes, so Spectra, ESOL, special education, reading recovery. Everyone will follow their normal schedule. If an adjustment is necessary for logistical reasons, then a case manager or a teacher would touch base and make those adjustments at the building level. At the K-5 level, teachers will be using Google Classroom, and at the 6-12 level, they'll be using Canvas as their learning management system. Having a consistent LMS is a part of the strategic plan. It was also a very clear request of families during the spring closure. The district will be working to provide resources to families through the district website to help them navigate both of those tools. We're also asking that staff use Zoom as their tool for live instruction and meetings with students and families. Staff should use their Francis Howell email account for a free educator Zoom account. Educator accounts don't have any limitations in terms of minutes and will allow the use of breakout rooms and polls. Staff can choose to log in through Clever, which also ensures that you have an educator account. Plans are in place should the free version of Zoom no longer be available when we're in a closure. We know that some used Google Hangout or Google Meet in the spring. However, it doesn't have the breakout room feature that's going to be essential for the type of instruction that needs to happen this fall. Now, Google has partnered with a third-party vendor, and there is an add-on feature for breakout rooms. However, because of the third party, it presents some security issues, and we're asking that it not be used for daily instruction. As you think about how instruction will look when delivered virtually, we're asking that you continue to focus your instruction on superhero standards. You continue to use your typical instructional delivery models. This means that if during in-person instruction you used workshop model, that you would continue to use the workshop model virtually. If you hosted conferences and small group instruction when in person, you would continue those practices during virtual instruction. Hopefully you've kind of sensed a little bit of a theme about building community and that being essential this year. And that's going to continue to hold true during a closure. We're asking that you find ways to help kids continue those peer connections, offer opportunities for social interaction, and maintain that sense of classroom community. That's all really going to be a priority. Finally, teams, they'll continue to meet weekly during their designated times. This year more than ever, PLC work is going to be essential. During a typical school day, your students have access to you for the large majority of the day. And our intention is to continue this high level of interaction when we're learning virtually. Each student should spend about 50% of their day interacting with their classroom teacher through direct instruction, small group activities, individual conferences, even independent practice in a breakout room where a teacher is bouncing between kids to check in and provide feedback. Now we know that some days you might have something else planned that necessitates more one-on-one interaction, and on those days kids might not hit that 50% target. However, those days should be the exception and not the norm. Again, our goal is that kids are spending the large majority of the day engaged with or having access to their classroom teacher. During a closure, assessment will continue to be an important part of the instructional day. Teachers should continue formative assessment practices just like normal. This would be even more important during a closure because teachers won't have the typical face-to-face opportunities to check over a student's shoulder or walk around the classroom as students are working or listen in on a group as they're talking. It's going to be essential that teachers are intentional about how they plan to provide formative feedback to students during a closure. This will be a great opportunity for PLC teams to collaborate and for content leaders to offer input. When it comes to summative assessments, teachers are asked to avoid giving them during the first 10 school days of a closure. Now, if a closure extends beyond 10 school days, then you're good to resume your summative assessments. Content leaders can help provide some guidance in this area as we potentially move in and out of closures. If you're unsure about an assessment, it's always safest to reach out to your building principal or an appropriate content leader to ask. Grades will look very different during the 2021 school year than they did during our spring closure. You'll notice that the task force broke their guidance into two groups. On the left side of the screen, it outlines what would happen during a short-term building closure. You can figure kind of 2 weeks or less. And on the right side, it assumes that we have a longer closure. So this might be more like a district closure or an indefinite closure. So let's start with the left side and talk about short-term closures. In that situation, we want to formatively assess kids. We want to provide feedback on their work. However, we're not assigning grades or being tight with due dates and deadlines for kids who are struggling to adapt to that virtual environment. Once we get past those first 2 weeks, things should really start to look pretty normal. This means that teachers would be taking grades, issuing assignments, you might have more firm deadlines. It also means that feedback should be provided on a regular basis to kids and families in a predictable way. Those superhero standards should continue to be the focus for instruction and feedback. Even during a long-term closure, it's important to remember that some kids are going to struggle in that virtual environment. Teachers will need to work individually with those kids and families and just offer those exceptions and grace as it makes sense for their particular situations. During a closure, typical communication processes would continue. Staff will continue to respond to emails in a 24-hour period. Families should continue to receive regular communication from their classroom teacher. Google Classroom pages should be updated multiple times a week for kids. As teachers begin the school year, even though we're not starting in a closure, it'll be important to establish procedures that you'll use should we move into a closure. And communicating all of this information to families ahead of time will help to ensure a smooth transition should a closure occur. Staff meetings and other normal building methods of communication would also continue in their normal manner and at the typical times should your building move into a closure. Each building will also establish a process for supporting kids who aren't engaging in the work when virtual. Building principals will communicate what this process will look like for your staff. In addition, no contact with a family for several days should trigger involvement from an administrator, a school counselor, or an ESC. In the spring, we didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare for the closure. And what we learned is, had we had more time, we would have sent students home with more or different supplies. And so as a result, the task force is recommending that teachers prepare a go bag for students. In the unlikely event that we move to a closure with zero notice, kids would at least be able to grab their toolbox out of their desk and their go bag that has some essential supplies. And so this might consist of typical school supplies like notebook paper, pencils, highlighters that a family might not have at home. It might also include some paper copies of upcoming assessments or key activities. Students who need modifications might have some necessary copies or resources in their go bags. Teachers might also wish to include some tools like whiteboards or multiplication charts or manipulatives or other frequently used items. Our content leaders are working to create a list of resources by content that would be important for students to access while learning virtually. This list will be shared with staff, and it might be helpful as you consider what you would like to include in your go bags. At the beginning of the school year, buildings will identify students who would need a device should the building move into a closure and kids need to learn virtually. While it's likely that we'll be able to accommodate all of these individual requests, it really will depend on the numbers. Families who wish to provide their own device for their student have been encouraged to identify a device that has internet access, a working camera, sound, keyboard, and access to a Chrome browser. For most kids at the elementary level, a tablet or a cell phone probably won't be sufficient. While the district's planning to provide Chromebooks to our virtual learners who request one, any device with the mentioned capabilities will really work. We know that when students get rolling during a closure, they will likely experience some technical difficulties like login issues or password issues. Should this occur after August 17th, families can send an email to the district help desk at help.desk@fhsdschools.org or call 851-HELP and select option 2, where they can leave a message for a technician to return. If students or families need help with an instructional program that a specific teacher is using as part of their online resources, it's been suggested that they reach out to the teacher directly. As we wrap up, there's 2 important pieces of information that I'd like to leave you with. The first is a link to a hyperdoc that's been created as a one-stop shop resource for all things virtual education. In this document, you'll find curriculum resources, technology tips and tricks, along with essential district information. To access this document, please visit bit.do/COVID hyperdoc. Please note that you'll need to use capital letters for COVID. The second thing I'll mention is that if we were to move into a full district-wide closure, we will reserve the first 2 days of the closure as non-student contact days. During these 2 days, staff will be provided with professional learning to help ensure a smooth transition into virtual instruction. much like our virtual teachers were provided with a boot camp prior to the start of their school year. We know that this school year presents a level of uncertainty. However, we also know that we are a strong district filled with talented educators who always take care of our students. Please know that many are working hard behind the scenes to provide whatever support you need as you envision how you'll prepare for our school year. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any content leader or member of the academic team. Stay healthy, and know that we wish you a fabulous school year.